Clinton Tolley. Thank you very much for being a guest on this podcast, New Voices in Phenomenology.
My pleasure.
And my first question is always, how would you explain what phenomenology is to somebody who has no idea of the notion, the concept?
Yes, no, it's a great way to start all these discussions. I mean, one thing is just the term in its roots. I know a lot of people in the phenomenological tradition also try to root the meaning of it through the etymology, but I feel like it's a okay, useful way to get the discussion going. And so in the term logos, the logic or reasoning or structure or something about, and then the phenomenon, the appearance, something having to do with showing up to something or someone. So putting those two thoughts together, that there's some aim when something is phenomenology or phenomenological activity is happening, an aim to track or look at or describe the logic or structure of the way things appear or show up or are in a phenomenal mode, whatever that is. That's maybe a first pass. So the logic of appearances is a way some people would talk about it. But then obviously all the interesting questions come immediately on the heels of that. What is it to be a phenomenon? What is it to be an appearance? What is the appearing to? What's in it? What resources can you have? Where does this logic part come from? And why would someone be motivated to try to start doing this particular kind of activity or relationship, or why should it happen in existence? All of that stuff is super interesting. So I know any way to start talking about it will just raise more questions, but those seem to me the very interesting ones. But just to fix a general sense, something I think in the tradition, the various traditions under phenomenology, the way people get going with it, some assumptions usually get made, like the phenomenon or appearance is for consciousness. It has some relation to some kind of, if not full person, some I, like a ich perspective type thing, that inside of the appearance or to a subject or something or other, there's a pointing to an object. And so the intentionality character of the appearance itself for consciousness towards an object, those things start to show up and when people talk about this kind of thing pretty quickly. And I think it's probably right that that's, especially in the historical mode, thinking like, yeah, when people say this term and they mean it to me a tradition in philosophy, that's probably what they have in mind, that kind of set of assumptions, set of activity that tries to focus on that layer of things or of existence. And then, yeah, I know you're interested in this too. For me, a lot of the interest in digging out new voices in the phenomenological tradition and also for the present is exactly along these dimensions of problems of, well, okay, so someone got this ball rolling and it seemed interesting and it totally did yield interesting results of a certain kind, but what's the significance of the results should always going back to the basics and asking hard questions. So yeah, so I don't know if that was at all in the direction of an answer of, to someone who doesn't know anything, what is phenomenology, but some first thoughts.
Yeah, maybe the logic of appearance might be something that we can just fix as a quick fix to work around. I find your answer interesting in that sense because it seems that your research is very much steeped in the tradition, especially of German philosophy, and also interested in working out connections between phenomenology and Kantian philosophy and neo-Kantian philosophy and so on. But now your answer is really more about the method of phenomenology, if you will, or the conceptual problem that arises when one tries to think phenomenologically. Do you think that one could feasibly do phenomenology without any sort of grounding in tradition, or would that be necessary in order to do informed phenomenological research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, one way of using the term, I think somewhat a very neutral way of using the term, people are engaged in doing phenomenology all the time when there is an attention to this consciousness relating to a subject-object thing happening in their even day-to-day life. one of the developments out of the philosophical traditions that are broadly grouped under phenomenology is the phenomenology of everyday life in that sense. When does this kind of thing show up? Not when you're you've read Husserl and you're trying all these tricks or something, and so you're steeped in the tradition in that sense, but more this normal thing happens in everyday life, and it shifts your focus of attention to appearances and their logic for some reason. And so you're not approaching it with, big books next to you or something, but just some experience in life has happened that occasions the attending to the logic of appearances rather than whatever else you were doing. And so, in the French traditions, the attempt to describe this in novels and plays by, the mid-century French phenomenologists, I think it's a great way to bring out the extent to which there is a use of the term where, a novel can describe how it could happen and come about, where there's no mention of any of the tradition, like, or Kant doesn't show up, no one shows up. It's just there's nausea, and what does that, what happens when that happens? So yeah, I think it's a nice question, and I think especially when I'm talking with some of our students who are in the situation, maybe they've heard the term a little bit, they don't know the tradition at all, but a lot of the, especially authors who also write in other genres, there's a lot of quick bridge building that you can have happen that makes the ideas more accessible and also makes it more interesting, I think, as to why you would care about this special kind of thing, the logic of appearances. How much is it already kind of integrated into different experiences you're already having? And so, you can get a hook into this is what phenomenology is like or is trying to do without having to go through all the very dense German philosophy. Although that's really interesting too, and I'd like you were bringing up, within the tradition and in the history of phenomenology, I'm very interested in the influences and kind of conceptual archaeology, methodological questions. So yeah, but no, yeah, I think it's a great thing to ask about. Can someone happen into doing phenomenology even if they don't have a giant library? And the answer has to be yes, of course.
And so your answer also suggests maybe a little bit that phenomenology sort of naturally attaches to the person that's doing it. So even if I wanted to do Husserlian phenomenology, it's still, I have to do it from out of my own experience and so on, and then with my own sort of presuppositions and preconceptions and so forth. And so it's almost inevitable that I will have a different sort of logic of appearance, if you will, developing for me than for, let's say, one of the historical personalities, or even for some peer that's also wanting to do phenomenology.
No, that's a great question. I know in the different traditions, and thinking about someone like Husserl, the ambition for some of the figures, I think, is to try to say one of the beauties of phenomenology as a method is that it can yield findings which have a universality such that it doesn't matter where the happening has come from, what other things might have been going on in the mundane natural history of the person's life or the society, but there can be an ascent or descent or some movement to these forms and structures that are the logic of appearing as such, no matter what, no matter when, no matter how. And that part of the ambition, I think, is interesting as a mark in the tradition, and especially, in more recent movements of thought, which have serious questions about what would that even mean to talk in that absolute universal mode. But as a point of historical fact, it is, I think, important that for some of the figures right at this turn of the century, like Husserl in particular, the universalizing ambition is very strong. And in part, it feels to them, I think, like the whole point, like it's because maybe this is the first and maybe only place that we can get to that universalizing form or whatever, that we could know what we were even talking about with science in general, or even math or logic, all the other things that seemed universal. This is the first universal that we can have displayed in the right way. So no, I mean, the impulse to say, oh, but yeah, then my appearance might be different than yours, or my logic of appearance might be different than yours, I think has to be held on to. But I think, like, I know you're aware of this tradition too, and its different twists and turns. one of the motivating forces at the beginning is, but maybe we could find something else or something. So, and in that way, then it starts to look very close to a lot of older traditions of philosophy, obviously Plato in a big way, and the different projects in the more immediate past of the 18th and 19th century in Germany. So yeah, I mean, I think phenomenology as a field in the present, one of the really interesting dynamics with the new voices is exactly on this kind of point about ambition of universality. How could you even talk in a way that was entitled to raise the questions in the right way? But in the historical tradition, it seems hard not to notice that there is that ambition.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So, for instance, the idea of this the absolute consciousness, or this givenness for consciousness, so these very, for instance, for Husserl, central ideas. Just on a personal level, maybe did you find them convincing, or do you find this grounding in conscious experience at bottom convincing, or is it more of an interesting idea that has to be historicized in a way when working?
Yeah, no, well, it's definitely at least the second thing. It's at least interesting and trying to think about the conditions for the arising of the movement and why was there this fixation and preoccupation with absoluteness and consciousness, and what would be the right routes to try to draw out to show, this makes total sense that they would try this, or that they would be drawn to this, or there would be this hope for this. Both looking backwards with the Kant, Hegel, and neo-Kantian, neo-Hegelian traditions, but also looking forwards in the kind of historical moment, politically, world historically, just continuing to wonder, is this really possible? Could we achieve this kind of thing? Has it already been achieved and we just have to re-articulate it? All of that historically, I think, is super interesting. So that's definitely the second part is true. As far as being convinced, I mean, it is, and I know you're working on this kind of project too. I still, with each author and, giant collected works, it's not always easy to figure out exactly what is meant by some of the universal, absolute, other kinds of terms that get associated with those two in particular. And so part of my own approach has been to try to fill out historical, corners and understructures, and to shine light on the terms that look maybe immediately like, oh, of course they have to mean this. And then when you start trying to catch on to the use of the terms and the language, it's much richer, but also can feel a little bit more obscure. Oh, okay, it doesn't quite mean this, it doesn't quite mean that. And one of the hard points, especially with the way phenomenology has been received in the States, is an emphasis, especially on Husserlian phenomenology, and the insistence that a lot of the questions that you might wonder about with absoluteness and universality, et cetera, when you ask them, or the tradition asks them, it's way too metaphysical, and that's not really what they're talking about. And then the attempt to try to say something else that doesn't have metaphysical import as what really is the project for phenomenology in this tradition, that is in a whole nother level of like, but the words say absolute, the words say this, and it talks about being and reality. But and so in the historical reception of some of these claims, there's also a kind of a further layer of confusing, enriching, but what to make of it, I don't know. So yeah, so I think, I mean, you were picking up this before, that my approach to trying to sort through some of this and think through and engage with it is very much in the historical mode, as far as just getting to a comprehension level, let alone judgment about if I think it's true or not. But yeah, I don't know if how does that sound to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have to agree, especially on the sort of layers that start to unfold once one tries to just really understand what it could mean to have an intentional relationship with something, and then the sort of confusion between metaphysical and epistemological and ontological questions and aspects.
Yes.
Is quite challenging. And so there's definitely some advantage to having some historical precedents to sort of give order to these problems. And this also leads me to the one of your articles, which we want to talk about today, which is called The Emergence of Phenomenology of Spirit. And I would frame it, maybe the narrative that you are opening that we are in the early 1910s, and Husserl's ideas, one is about to appear or has just appeared. And then there's all these younger students really interested in this new phenomenological, maybe it's not even a movement yet, but it is a new method at any rate. And so they are carving out their own niche. They are adding sort of new layers to the consciousness that is at the center of phenomenology. And what you're doing, as far as I understand it, is looking at 4 women phenomenologists and their dissertations and assessing what these new additions to phenomenology are, and which you then sort of label the phenomenology of spirit. But can you talk a little more about what you explore in this article?
Yeah, no, it was an exciting opportunity. So Dalia Nasser and Kristen Giesdahl are putting together, they've already put together a collection of primary texts with the heading, women philosophers in the long 19th century in Germany. So that's their research focus, to try to highlight some of the, in a way, very familiar thought of raising new voices that haven't been heard, like the podcast itself, out of this stretch of the historical tradition in German language philosophy. And so in there's some contributions by Edith Stein and Gerda Walter. And then they have a second volume that is just about to come out, hopefully later this calendar year, which are interpretive essays trying to give the narrative of this historical development. And so mine is on this long 19th century, where that includes the beginning of the 20th century. And it focuses on 4 women who are students, usually in some form connected to the Munich tradition, school circle, but also the Göttingen, Freiburg, Husserl traditions of the early phenomenological circles. Yes, and then what I try to do in the paper is not just bring to light their super interesting research and phenomenological investigations, but try to position it within this debate that's happening, I think, within the phenomenological tradition itself at that moment. Like you were saying, it's more like a circle and less like a tradition that hasn't even developed yet, but it's starting to develop. And I do try to, maybe it's a little bit, I don't know if just provocative or raise the question in provocative terms, is there a shift already in this early part of the phenomenological tradition away from a philosophy that's focused methodologically on consciousness or Bewusstsein, and just the pure ich or ego that's relating in it, and the object pointed to this very thin, flimsy seeming structure, towards what I call not just a phenomenology or a philosophy of consciousness, but a phenomenology of spirit. And so then when you use that term, everyone thinks, oh, you mean it's going towards Hegel because of the famous work. And I don't want to say it's not going towards Hegel. And so part of the narrative of these 4 women and their dissertations and early research publications is an increasing preoccupation with the concept of spirit, of Geist, and its place within this early phenomenological set of circles. And so then, yes, the invitation is, there's been a lot of work trying to put early phenomenology in conversation with Kant and the neo-Kantian resurgence that was happening at the time. My own contribution, I think, is both highlighting these 4 women, not all of whom have gotten much attention. Edith Stein obviously has gotten a lot of work, especially of late, but to then have them contribute to the specific conversation of, a development of or infusion of neo-Hegelianism within the early phenomenological tradition, even if people are aware, okay, when Eugen Fink eventually, somewhere Hegel is going to show up. But and so both, calling it the emergence of phenomenology of spirit, to invite some of the Hegelian overtones and suggest that they're already at work in these early moments. So those are some of the invitations to questions that I want to try to have people think about as they're reading some of these authors. And once you do look at it this way, the terminology does kind of jump off the page. And at least I try to make the case that you don't have to look that hard. It really does have this kind of, developmental narrative towards Geist. and the Phenomenology of Geist. So yeah, so that's like a snapshot of the piece. And I hope that, the four authors, Margarete Kalanick, Elsa Voigtlander, Edith Stein, and Gerda Walter, they all of their dissertations are available now digitally. Stein's has been translated. Walter's, I think, is in the process of being translated. And the other two dissertations have not been translated. So this is also a way to try to bring some of their work into the English language conversations. Really interesting analyses of the experience of color and meaning in elementary color experience with Kalanick, self-feeling and intentionality questions with Voigtlander, and it all moving into questions about Einfühlung, or feeling into, whether that's in relation to a person or in relation to a meaning, and then the social ontological structuring that's underneath it in this mystical spiritual direction with Walter. So that's that piece. And definitely hope, I already have been in some conversations that when we were at this conference with George Heffernan, who's been working on some of this stuff, and Antonio Calcano, so there's other people, and it's a great time to open up some of these books and start thinking anew with some of these new voices.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And maybe a little further inquiry into what you were already sort of explaining. So phenomenology of the spirit, maybe Hegelian, but not directly in Hegel's footsteps, so to speak. So you mentioned that during the time when these four women wrote their dissertations and developed these new ideas, what predominated phenomenological discourse was this sort of the pure I with the intentional relation, and so there's this new ideas about what the phenomenological subject is, in a way, like the psychophysiological body, the ensouled being, the pure I, and then and so on. And then there are these new experiences, which you already also mentioned a little bit. So the experience of color and the nexus between the sensation of color and a certain emotion, and so on. So would you say that there's a correlation between the kinds of experiences that are being developed and the kinds of, let's say, phenomenological personae that get sort of invented or conceived along the way, or how does the spirit come about? Maybe if I want to pose the question a little shorter.
No, it's a nice way to put the question. So in the tradition of philosophy of spirit that does grow out of Hegel, I think when people think of the term and the insertion of the term and the co-opting of the term in that German philosophical moment, it's, in relation to Kant, especially, and the thinning out of the transcendental ego or ich in relation to functions and activities that seem very, again, ontologically non-committal for strategic reasons. And then in the aftermath of the Kantian critical project, in a way that I think foreshadows some of the aftermath of the early Husserlian insertions of a philosophy of consciousness in relation to phenomenology, there's pushback about, well, but you keep saying you don't want to commit to what is under the ich of consciousness or apperception. We just know there is at least this activity happening or something, or there's being that is consciousness, and inside of it there's a relation to an appearance or an intuition or something. But what's beyond that? Well, we're just bracketing that. So a lot of that stuff happens with Kant already. And so the development in the next 25 years towards Hegel's philosophy of spirit, I think, is the next generation wrestling with, but of course there have to be some kinds of ontological or metaphysical conditions for the philosophy of consciousness, as Reinhold and eventually Fichte would call it. And what are those? And then also, not just that they have to be there in some sense, but we have to think through the way that they condition consciousness in order to really answer the questions we were wondering about with consciousness in the first place, especially, can consciousness ever get to the truth? And so the way in which spirit comes in as a concept in that tradition, I think, is an attempt to catch a bunch of the questions that were left open from Kant and give them a direction towards a specific answer, that spirit will be the answer somehow. And so moving from initial investigations of consciousness to needing to appeal to and explain and understand consciousness in the context of spirit is the general trajectory. And that, I think, it does happen in this early decades with the phenomenological tradition itself. But what you were picking up on before is striking, that there's, very particular dimensions within the descriptions of consciousness that in the Kant moment aftermath, but also in early phenomenology as well, seemed especially salient as calling some of these questions up. So the fact that color isn't just mute, as like when it shows up, it's like a flat paint or something, as a thing to be targeted by consciousness, but that it in itself, when it shows up as an appearance, even seems to point off into other directions, not just towards some physical object, but towards some kind of meaningfulness or affective interactivity in the aesthetic sense. That's something that Margarete Kalinic explores in her dissertation, and it leads her quickly to think about, but does that mean within consciousness there's already not just a pointing to an object, but a pointing in the object towards more that's not just an empty X, but has this kind of integrated network feel in relation to other aspects of life and meaning and spiritual eventually concerns in the sense of the aesthetic and maybe even towards the religious. And that's one just case study. And then we were mentioning empathy or Einfühlung as another thing that does show up in some sense in consciousness, but immediately opens the door into all this other kinds of, again, just networking in relation to meaningfulness and other, in the Stein exposition, other ichs, other persons, other living embodied and souled existences. And so, that too, I think the specific experiences that are being picked up on here do point in the direction of, well, what kind of thing is being engaged with within, allegedly just within consciousness? They hook into what would in the older tradition go very naturally under the heading of spiritual concerns. So aesthetic, religious, moral, and the kind of meaning of life and value sense. And that's definitely in focus in each of these for women, their dissertations. And so, that helps kind of feed into the story of they're moving towards a concern with spirit. Also in the paper I do, and this too, there's other backstory reasons for wanting to insist on the centrality of spirit, that Husserl was giving lectures on Geist. Max Scheler was, centering a lot of his thought around the question of Geist. Hedwig Konrad Martius is also thinking through the metaphysics of soul and spirit in the same, just stretch of a handful of years. So it's in the mix, and it's in the air. Spirit is in the air. Some thoughts, but a great way of asking the question.
Thanks. And now it's really a nice analogy that you open up between Kant and the idealists, and then Husserl and the as they are called, realistic phenomenologists, who sort of see the evident need that there needs to be a metaphysics of consciousness in the wide sense of all that is also surrounding and embedding consciousness. So I think there's a very useful perspective to have when approaching the dynamic of the phenomenological movement as a whole. And I think your article is a very, very nice segue into that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, just again to try to invite people to think one step further on that particular way of putting it, because I do think there has been an appeal in some ways to some people in this next generation of phenomenologists, or especially coming out of the Munich school, to a kind of realism that has to do with metaphysics, and that, they're, through the correspondence with Ingarden, it comes out with Edith Stein. There has to, exactly the way you were putting it, some kind of metaphysics, something or other. It can't just all be bracketed, free-floating, who knows what's. And I think that that's right, and you can use the term realism, but by using the term spirit, it adds to the sense of the kind of core sense of real. It's not just real in the analytic philosophy neutral sense of, I don't know, existent in some causal grounding way or who knows what. But it really is a spiritual reality that the core, and this comes out especially at the end in Stein's later work, and then already in Gerda Walter's dissertation, and especially in the Scheler writings of the period, that what's really real, and this makes it sound very Hegelian, is the absolute infinite spirit, that everything else is. So the metaphysics of consciousness isn't just real in some sense that goes beyond the logic of appearings. It is that, but you have to go to the next step, which is what is that, the metaphysics of that reality. And ultimately, at least my own sense of this decade is that they are moving towards a spiritualist metaphysics, of a realist spiritualism in that sense. That and so that makes it less neutral seeming, that like, oh, we get to add in, of course, there are things, not just appearances, and you can't pretend like you don't need the metaphysics of that. But when you look under the hood of what the things are in the deepest sense, the answer increasingly for this decade looks like, oh, it's spirit. That's what's really real. And so it's a kind of idealism, if you are thinking in the German idealist terms, but it really isn't the idealism of the bracketing of consciousness and free-floating appearances type non-metaphysically committal idealism. It's like super metaphysically committal in the spiritualist direction. So yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I know that when we've talked about, and I've talked about it with groups, phenomenology circles and workshops, that any metaphysics can make some phenomenologists get uncomfortable because you're supposed to have bracketed it, but especially spiritualist metaphysics can make some phenomenologists uncomfortable. And part of this project is to just invite the historical perspective to come to the surface, that well, the people that you think are really smart and are influential at the core of its early development, a lot of them seem to think you have to go in this direction. So, we should at least talk about it. So that's, yeah, hoping for more conversation.
And in that sense, I'm thanking you very much, Clinton Tolley, for taking the time to speak to me. And I'm looking forward to your future research in the history of phenomenology.
Yes, and yours too. Thanks so much for doing this podcast. And please, anyone be in touch if you have thoughts about any of the material. And I'll look forward to seeing what comes next with the new voices.
Thank you.